Alright, let's take a look at this question. We're given a diagram of a leaf, and you can see there are 5 arrows labeled 1 to 5. Each of these arrows shows how different substances move in and out of the leaf during photosynthesis. Just below the diagram, there's a table with 4 answer options, A, B, C, and D. Each row suggests what substances each arrow is showing. Now, before we jump to the answer, let's quickly go over what actually happens during photosynthesis. Plants take in carbon dioxide from the air through tiny openings in their leaves called stomata. They also absorb water through their roots, and that water travels up through the xylem to the leaf. Inside the leaf, sunlight is used to convert carbon dioxide and water into glucose, which the plant uses for energy. And as a byproduct, oxygen is produced and released into the air. With that in mind, let's try to figure out what each arrow is showing. Starting with arrow 1, this points away from the palisade mesophyll, which is the main site of photosynthesis. Since photosynthesis releases oxygen, and the arrow is showing something leaving the leaf, this is most likely oxygen. Now arrow 2 seems to be pointing out of the xylem and into the leaf tissue. That suggests it's showing the movement of water, which makes sense. Water travels through the xylem to reach the cells where photosynthesis takes place. Arrow 4 is very similar, also linked to the xylem, so it's likely representing water too. Arrow 3 is showing movement in the palisade layer as well, but this time it's directed away from the area where glucose is produced. Since glucose is the main product of photosynthesis, this arrow is probably showing glucose being moved to other parts of the plant. And finally, arrow 5 is showing a substance entering the leaf through the stomata. That would be carbon dioxide, which the plant needs to start photosynthesis in the first place. So to sum it up, arrow 1 is oxygen, arrows 2 and 4 are water, arrow 3 is glucose, and arrow 5 is carbon dioxide. Based on this, the correct answer has to be option C. Alright, let's take a look at this next one. We're shown a diagram of an aphid feeding on a leaf. You can see its mouthparts piercing down into the different layers of the leaf. The question is, when the aphid feeds, in what order do its mouthparts pass through the tissues of the leaf? Now, aphids feed on sugar, and sugar is transported through the phloem in the leaf. So to reach the phloem, the aphid's mouthparts have to pass through a few layers. First, they pierce the upper epidermis, which is the outermost protective layer of the leaf. Next, they move through the palisade cells, which are the main photosynthetic cells packed with chloroplasts. And finally, the mouthparts reach the phloem, where the sugar is found. So, the right sequence is, first the mouthparts go through the upper epidermis, then into the palisade cells, and finally reach the phloem where the sugar is. And that's exactly what option B shows, which is why B is the correct answer here. Alright, so in this next question, they're asking us which processes in plants need either nitrate ions or magnesium ions. They've given us 3 different processes to consider: the synthesis of cellulose, the synthesis of chlorophyll, and the synthesis of proteins. Each one is marked either yes or no, to show whether nitrate or magnesium ions are involved. Now let's think about each one. First, cellulose, that's actually made from glucose, not from nitrate or magnesium ions. So that one should definitely be a no. Then there's chlorophyll, which does require magnesium, so that should be a yes. And finally, proteins are built using nitrate ions, so that's another yes. When we look through the options, we can see that option D is the one that gets everything right. It correctly says no for cellulose, yes for chlorophyll, and yes for proteins. So, based on all that, option D is the correct answer. Alright, so now we are moving back to theory questions. Here we are given a photomicrograph once again, and the question clearly states, as it says here, figure 5.1 is a photomicrograph of the center of a plant root. And this plant root cross-section has labels J, K, and L. This question is mainly linked to chapter 7, but the structures we are seeing here are actually quite similar to those we've studied in leaf cells, so identifying them should be simple. Now let's take a look. This part labeled J is phloem, and it's found on the outer side. Then we have K, which is xylem and it is positioned more toward the inner side. And L, this is actually the vascular bundle. That means it is made up of both the xylem and the phloem together. So let's go ahead now. The next part of the question asks us to identify each of the tissues labeled J and K. Now we already know this. J is phloem, whereas K is xylem, so we will write both clearly in our answer to get the full 2 marks. Then the next part of the question says, state the term used to describe the group of tissues labeled L. And we know that L is the vascular bundle here. Now moving on to the next part. Here they ask us to state 2 ways in which the structure of a cell in tissue K will differ from a cell in tissue J. So the answer to this is simple. First, xylem has thick walls with lignin, whereas phloem has thin walls and does not have lignin. Second, xylem cells do not have any cell contents or organelles, but phloem cells do contain cell contents and organelles. We will explore all of this in much more detail when we properly study chapter 7, so do not worry for now. Just make sure you understand the basic difference between xylem and phloem at this stage. Alright, now moving on to the next question. This one is based on the concept of limiting factors, and it asks us to describe and explain the pattern of results between a light intensity of 20 and 30 arbitrary units. So for the description, we say that from a light intensity of 20 to 30 arbitrary units, the rate of photosynthesis remains relatively constant or it plateaus. Now for the explanation, we understand that at this point, increasing the light intensity does not further increase the rate of photosynthesis because some other factor has now become limiting. Usually, this could be the concentration of carbon dioxide or the temperature. The plant is already making full use of the available light, so now the rate is being held back by the limited supply of another essential resource. So we will simply write, between a light intensity of 20 and 30 arbitrary units, the rate of photosynthesis remains constant. This indicates that the increase in light intensity no longer affects the rate. This happens because light is no longer the limiting factor. Instead, some other factors such as the concentration of carbon dioxide or the temperature may be limiting the rate of photosynthesis. So even though the light intensity continues to increase, the rate of photosynthesis does not increase any further. Now in this part of the question, they mention that the investigation was repeated with an increased concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and you have to draw a curve on figure 6.1 to show the pattern of results that would be expected from this second investigation. Now because the concentration of carbon dioxide has been increased in this second investigation, we need to draw a new curve on the same graph to show the new pattern that we would expect. So here's how we will make it. The new line will also begin from the origin, that is, from 0, 0, just like before. In the initial part of the graph, the line should rise with the same gradient or slope as the original curve, and this should continue up to at least a light intensity of 5. This part shows a steady increase in the rate of photosynthesis with light intensity, just like in the original experiment. However, after a light intensity of around 19, the line should begin to level off. This means it should become flat, showing that the rate of photosynthesis has reached a plateau. But this time, the line levels out at a higher point than in the previous graph, since the increased carbon dioxide concentration allows the plant to photosynthesize more effectively. So the final part of the graph, from light intensity 19 up to 30, should be a horizontal line that stays at a higher rate of photosynthesis than the original curve. Now moving on to the next part of the question, they ask us to state the name of the product of photosynthesis that contains carbon atoms. So here we will simply write glucose. Yes, glucose is the correct answer because it contains 6 carbon atoms. If you remember, the chemical formula of glucose is C6H12O6, which clearly shows that it includes carbon. Alright, then they ask us to outline the uses made by a plant of named carbohydrates. Now we have already done this question back in chapter 4, but this time we can understand it more clearly as it's about the uses of carbohydrates. So we will write, plants use carbohydrates in several ways. Glucose is used in respiration to release energy, which is needed for different cell activities. Some of the glucose is turned into starch so that it can be stored. Glucose is also used in the production of amino acids, proteins, and lipids, all of which are important for growth and repair. Another carbohydrate, cellulose, is used to build the cell walls and provide strength and support. And sucrose is used to transport sugars throughout the plant.